intellects, the Stoics, the Platonists, from Australian Aborigines and Redskins. I don't think he had a football team. He will collect the same triumphantly monotonous denunciations of oppression, murder, treachery, and falsehood, the same injunctions of kindness to the aged, the young, and the weak, of almsgiving and impartiality and honesty. He may be a little surprised, I certainly was, to find that precepts of mercy are more frequent than precepts of justice. But he will no longer doubt that there is such a thing as the law of nature. There are, of course, differences. There are blindnesses in particular cultures, just as there are savages who cannot count up to 20. But the pretense that we are presented with a mere chaos is simply false and should be contradicted in season and out of season, wherever it is met. I love the way he takes Paul's injunction to Timothy. Far from finding a chaos, we find exactly what we should expect if good is indeed something objective, and reason the organ whereby it is apprehended. That is, a substantial agreement with considerable local differences of emphasis and perhaps no one code that includes everything. So you want to follow up on that?
Well, yeah, it's just like when you quoted the Romans 1.
Right, exactly.
I passed through there and I saw the sign and I kept going.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of like God says you were without excuse by virtue of examining what I made.
Right.
And so I'm thinking, wow, how do you get to that?
Yeah.
And that's kind of behind my question.
Yeah, well, what's the process of getting to it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sounds like
Well, I'll tell you one thing, it isn't. It's not, and that's why I balked a little bit at your use of the word reduce. It's not, it's more like counterpoint and PowerPoint. It's more a poetic apprehension.
So
It's more, it involves intuition and imagination. And here's another, glad you raised this, because I may not have time to get to this tomorrow, because I've only gone through like the first third of tonight's lecture already. Up until the modern age, when we spoke of intellect, and sometimes the word reason itself, and sometimes the word rationality, included imagination and intuition. One of the great changes, I will get to this some tomorrow. One of the great changes is what constitutes knowledge. What constitutes knowledge and appropriate processes of obtaining knowledge. And when, particularly with the 17th century, with Descartes and Bacon particularly, one of them stressing empirical analysis, let's look at Bacon, and the other stressing a rational mathematical approach, that is, a pure reason. Neither of them had any room for an imaginative apprehension of the stuff of creation. And that text in 1 Kings 4, which first says, he wrote all these proverbs, which are basically in poetic form, and songs. He's the wisest person who ever lived. He looked at creation, and he wrote a bunch of songs about it, and poems. So, now, again, we don't think we don't think poetry is a good way to do ethics. I'm sure that if you went to most philosophy departments, you go to UC Irvine, you're not going to be reading a lot of poetry in the ethics. Well, maybe you will, I don't know, maybe bad poetry. And I think when we look at things like the heavens declare the glory of God or Romans 1, we tend to think that, gee, if we observed it analytically, what Paul seems to be suggesting is we could deduce these things if we did the right kind of analysis. But I think there's a different kind of apprehension of creation that's in view, and it's an apprehension which is more like that which poets and painters have. It's more like that storytellers have, where they perceive the narrative of it, not the analytic logic of it. They perceive the narrative. And so there's a story, when you see the same storyline happening all the time, you begin to think, gee, maybe there's something, maybe that's one of those narrative structures that informs the whole structure of creation.
We talk about the structure of the soul.
Structure of the soul?
And its alignment with the creation, created order.
Right.
And I can see where one of my greatest dangers is really asking the wrong questions, or not understanding what questions to ask.
Yeah, well,
I like to be quiet.
join the club. No, but I think, and that's, so I'll get to this more tomorrow. I'll talk about this reductionistic tendency, and then and Lewis. I want to quote from Lewis. See, Lewis. I talked about real reality a minute ago. I'll anticipate what I'm going to say tomorrow. Lewis often spoke about the imagination, and again, here there's very little original in Lewis, actually. In fact, I was reading a book in preparation for this on the Narnia Chronicles. There was a section in here on the Narnia Chronicles, and the author pointed out how a lot of people think Lewis was so imaginative, all the things he came up with, and it all came out of medieval cosmology. Almost everything is straight out of, and so he didn't do much original at all, actually, in Narnia. His view of imagination, which again was the reigning view for centuries, for millennia, was that imagination conveyed real knowledge. That the imagination conveyed real knowledge, and the way he puts it, he says, I am a rationalist. I believe that reason is the organ of truth. If you want something, we'll call it truth. You want propositions. Reason is the way you get to truth. But imagination is an organ to perceive reality and aspects of reality which cannot be reduced to syllogistic reason.
So perceive like image?
Perceive like image, imagination. Yeah, So and that's why God is called a father. That's why, I mean, the scriptures are full of works that require us to do imaginative exercise, to imaginative work. When I was in seminary, one of the most helpful things I learned in seminary was from a hermeneutics professor who said, and mostly people who are going to be preachers in this class, don't ever commit what he called the kernel and husk fallacy. And what he meant by that was, don't ever assume that the text of Scripture, especially things like the book of Revelation or Psalms, things that have a lot of imagery or parables, don't ever assume that your task is to find the husk of abstraction in the midst of all that messy narrative and metaphor, and then throw away the text. It says God inspired the text. God inspired the metaphors. God inspired the narrative. So the story is always primary. The story always has priority over your interpretation of it, not just because it's inspired and your interpretation isn't, but because of the fact that, as he believed as I do, having a high view of the inspiration of Scripture, this was the best way to convey it. It's not as if God was working with poor primitive people who didn't have analytic reasoning skills like we do today. And he did the best he could given what he was working with. I don't believe that. I believe that this, in fact, was the best way to convey. When Jesus uses parables to teach, which some people say, it got its point across really well. Well, no, it didn't. The apostles didn't even understand what he was saying at the time. So there was a kind of mystery included in there, and I think that's why we have to let the word of Christ dwell in us richly. We have to live with the Scriptures for a long time. We have to live with the imagery that's there, live with the stories, make them a part of our intuition so that our imaginations are trained properly. And then the truth that's there, it's not that we've reduced the truth to neat propositions, but we've apprehended the truth. Now, I got a little bit away from, Lewis says that there are aspects of reality which cannot be reduced to propositional content. He's a big believer in propositional content, and he's a big believer in analysis. But he believes there are certain things, when Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, well, we can reason from that and tease out